Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the shattered aura of a guy who, up until very recently, looked completely unstoppable. We're talking about Ilia Topuria. We're going to break down exactly what went down on the night of his very first professional loss, but more importantly, we're looking at what this defeat actually means for his future in the sport. So what happens when an undefeated fighter loses that aura of invincibility? For years, Topuria just looked unstoppable. Every prediction he made, spot on. Every opponent, just another name on his hit list. His confidence literally became his identity, and we all bought into it. Fans, analysts, and most importantly, Ilia himself. But then, in one single night, reality hit, and it hit hard. Everything changed. And look, it's not just because he lost. Every great fighter loses eventually, right? What made this so wild was what happened after the fight, when the medical reports came out and we saw the real extent of the damage.
All right, part one, the fall of perfection, the brutal reality of physical trauma.
When you look at the medical reports, they paint a picture of a guy taking just unimaginable punishment. We're talking fractures around both orbital bones, the delicate bones surrounding his eyes. That's the kind of injury that changes a fight in a split second. Early in the opening round, he caught a massive uppercut. At first glance, it just looked like a heavy shot, but as the fight dragged on, the damage really started to show. Suddenly, his timing was totally off. His reactions were sluggish. And by those championship rounds, his vision was severely compromised. I mean, just imagine standing in front of one of the deadliest fighters on the planet, and you can barely even see what's coming at you. Most guys would be desperately looking for a way out, but incredibly, Topuria just kept marching forward, essentially half blind, against a world-class killer. But here's the crazy part. Despite the swelling, the fractures, the absolute beating he took, there's actually some really good news. The doctors determined he doesn't even need surgery. That is huge. We've seen so many fighters take similar damage and get sidelined for months, right? But for Topuria, the recovery estimates are saying he could be physically healed up in just a matter of weeks. Which brings us to Section 2, the invisible battle, moving past the physical damage.
Because, let's be real, bones heal.
Cuts are going to heal. And eventually, the swelling disappears.
But what happens when an undefeated fighter experiences defeat for the very first time? That is the real question. We're talking about an entirely different, invisible, psychological war here. For years, Topuria carried himself like a guy who genuinely knew deep down in his bones that nobody could touch him. He'd predict victories, call his shots, talk about future champions like they were just speed bumps in his rearview mirror. And every single win backed that up. It turned his confidence into absolute certainty. But now, that zero on his record is gone. The mystery is completely shattered. He has to actually process failure now. And history tells us this specific mental hurdle is exactly what breaks some fighters while forging others into absolute legends.
So here we are at Section 3, the crossroads of defeat, succumbing to doubt or choosing to evolve. He's basically staring down two distinct paths right now. First, there's the path of doubt. This is that little nagging voice in the back of your head asking, wait, was I overrated? Am I really as elite as I thought I was? Once that doubt creeps in, man, every punch feels different. You're suddenly fighting yourself just as much as your opponent. But then, you have the other option, the path of evolution. Instead of letting defeat break you, true champions use it as raw proof that there's another level to unlock. They completely drop that exhausting illusion of being perfect, and they just start chasing pure improvement. And what's so fascinating about Topuria is that years ago, way before this loss was even a blip on the radar, he was asked how he'd handle defeat. Now, most undefeated fighters absolutely hate talking about losing, but he gave this eerily prophetic answer. He said, losing wouldn't change who I am. I will still trust myself, still believe in myself, still move forward. Back then, sounded like your standard textbook fighter confidence. But today, it sounds like a literal prediction. His mental toughness is getting a real-world test right now. It's super easy to talk a big game about adversity when you're winning, but it's a whole different animal when you are actively living through it. Which leads us to our final section, the ultimate evolution, the terrifying potential of a reborn champion. If you're a fan looking for a silver lining, it really comes down to one single number, 29. Ilia Topuria is only 29 years old. Just let that sink in for a second. In this sport, a lot of guys don't even hit their absolute physical prime until their early 30s. Some don't peak until way after that. He has so much time left on the clock, so much room to grow, and so much invaluable experience still left to gain inside the Octagon. It all comes down to the anatomy of a comeback. You study the mistakes, you plug the holes in your game, and you evolve. That's the formula. Great champions use failure as fuel to become exponentially more dangerous. Honestly, looking back, this loss could end up being the single most important moment of his entire career. Because a lot of times, a fighter's most spectacular victory comes right on the heels of their absolute worst defeat.
So, I'm going to leave you with this. Everyone right now is so hyper-focused on the loss, the orbital fractures, what went wrong. But what if this isn't the beginning of Ilia Topuria's decline? What if this is actually the spark of his evolution? You know, the most terrifying fighter in the world isn't always the undefeated golden boy. Sometimes it's the guy who finally tasted his own blood, learned exactly why it happened, and is walking back into that cage with a massive chip on his shoulder. If that's the version of Ilia Topuria we see next, well, the rest of the division might have a much, much bigger problem on their hands than they even realize.